I've been trying to reach you. My comm was out. You got the singularity code, that's our ticket out of here. Get that code to zone! Don't wait for me! Oh, fuck me!
Dead Space is a third-person action horror game starring Isaac Clarke as he and a team of rescue operatives try to uncover what happened on the mining colony ship USG Ishimura. Atmosphere. From the very start of the game, there's a ton of foreboding events that only become more impactful the more times you play the game and realise what stuff means. But the Ishimura is a foreboding place, with blood splattered everywhere and scrawlings on the walls from the insane crew talking of disturbing events both past and future. The lighting is incredibly moody, but I often found it wasn't very dark, with the flashlight not really being needed in most places unless you turn the brightness down below the default. The sound design plays into things a lot, with many creepy auditory events like disembodied voices whispering Isaac's name, reverberating eerily down the empty corridors. Despite being set on a spaceship, the game keeps the environments fresh with the intimidatingly large and dangerous machines you have to climb through, as well as the vacuum chambers and a few brief sections in space. But it doesn't stop there, with parts of the ship being covered in the disturbing, pulsating organic growths that have taken hold, and finally in a few parts near the end there's the unsettling religious displays and shrines, which are just haunting to see, with people leaving candles lit in the name of something that's causing them to mutate and transform into the horrifying necromorphs. There are bodies scattered all over the ship, and every now and then you witness the final moments of a survivor to drive home this feeling of loneliness and hopelessness. There are a lot of corridors that look like trouble before you even go down them, and apprehension and tension are there all the time. That's one Harry Mason. Scares. Nearly all of the horror comes from the necromorphs, with their mangled human designs, twisted limbs and disturbing shapes or forms, with some being more animal than human and some being barely that. They constantly make surprise appearances, with these horrific monsters jumping out of the vents, and sometimes corpses you see on the floor aren't corpses after all. Every surprise attack is followed up by an orchestral hit to emphasize the moment. There are tons of these jump scares, with some being more effective than others, and as the game goes on they get less frightening as you kind of get used to it. The game uses a few scripted events, which are usually to introduce a new enemy. Certain enemy types become cannon fodder as you continuously upgrade your weapons, but some can still be stress-inducing, like the large tentacle monster that makes you try and shoot its weak point before you're pulled into the wall, or the swarm of bug-like leeches that latch onto Isaac and drain your health very quickly. The game also has the invincible enemy manufactured by the game's antagonist that requires special circumstances to stop, but shooting its legs off and using stasis on it to freeze it allows you to get far enough away that it wasn't really a problem. Most of the enemy encounters can be panic-inducing. When dealing with multiple enemy types, it mostly depends on how you spend your upgrade and credits. Going through an area with low health can be stressful, but buying sufficient supplies makes it along the lines of pest control. There are some parts of the early game where you feel weak and vulnerable, but as the game goes on and you upgrade, there's a sweet satisfaction to tearing enemies to pieces with your weaponry. At the end of the day, all Dead Space really does is use jump scares to cause panic to the player by suddenly throwing them into combat, but it does this all the time. By a third of the way into the game you've encountered all the major enemy types and should know how to deal with them. There's not really a lot else to frighten the player besides that. It really depends on your mileage, but I'd grown accustomed to it by the halfway point. That's still one Harry Mason. Sound design. The soundtrack consists of some unnerving orchestral string sections that give the game both a cinematic but also a creepy feel. It's utilised really well and comes out swinging whenever anything happens. It manages to range from uncertainty to straight up frantic terror when it needs to, but never feels overused and shows up when you need it to and rarely any other time. The rest of the game uses a wide variety of ambiance effects, from spooky whispering voices calling out Isaac's name to the low rumble of the ship's engines. One of my favourite effects is the muffling you experience when in a vacuum, and the sounds of the rig hacking the doors that are just cool sounding to me. The combat effects are powerful and punchy, and the sound of Isaac stamping on bodies produces a sickening crunch, along with his strained grunting that really makes stomping fun. The screams of enemies vary from howling to almost silly, with some enemies sounding more like a cartoonish shriek. The voice acting is pretty good for a few characters that actually talk, and some characters in the audio logs were greatly underutilized, sounding incredibly creepy and not coming up often enough. The directional audio is well implemented and very useful in telling which side the enemies are coming from, but sometimes with everything going on it all blends together with the music, ambiance, Isaac grunting and the sound of plasma blasts and the enemies splattering on the walls, but it's hard to say it's not enjoyable nonetheless. That's 2 Harry Masons. Gore. Cutting off limbs is the name of the game, and the arsenal of weaponry allows you to really let loose, cutting things to pieces. Blasting off limbs with a plasma cutter or tearing into them with the Ripper never gets old or boring. There's a ton of gory moments, from the enemy transformations to stomping on corpses. Bodies explode and splatter blood everywhere as you gouge them up. The gore in Dead Space is immensely fun, and with how detestable some of the enemies can be, it's very enjoyable to rip into them. That's 3 Harry Masons. Story. Isaac Clarke and the crew of the spaceship Kellyan arrive on the Ishimera and find it abandoned and in quarantine. After breaking the quarantine, the Necromorphs attack and leave only Isaac, Kendra, and Commander Hammond alive. The plot is mostly fixing various problems with the Ishimera and discovering more about the things that took place there, with frequent mentions of a marker and a Church of Unitology. There's tons of audio logs and text reports on the transformations and how people met their end at the hand of the slowly changing crew of the Ishimera. There's some backstabbing, and it's sometimes difficult trying to figure out who to trust of your 2 remaining crewmates, with both of them showing signs of mental stress, along with Isaac having hallucinations of his own. There's a few plot twists, and they spin the story around, changing what you know about some characters and even Isaac himself, making the final score 4 out of 5 Harry Masons. Dead Space's presentation is flawless, but whilst it uses puzzles and combat to keep the player engaged, it rarely does the same for the scares, with it using the same techniques and scripted events throughout the entire game. Again, I'd like to remind you this whole thing is down to my opinion in horror games, so if you don't share his opinion, then that's cool, I get it. I'd like to point out that whilst I ripped enemies to pieces with a smile on my face, I did not scream like a banshee or run like the computer, and I advise you don't either. If there are more horror reviews in the pipeline, then thanks for watching. You can always go check out Bums in the middle of the night. Peace.